think we're going to get started here, and we're going to start with a question from Pete.
It's a relatively personal question, but I was wondering what plans do you have for personal research into metaphysical areas currently, in terms of either monographs, articles, books, personal research?
Okay. So I've been doing a lot of work on studying the Theosophical composer Cyril Scott, who was a British composer who lived from 1879 to 1970. And he wrote music that is very evocative of nature spirits and devas. And I've been experimenting with what it's like to align myself with that level of being and see what kind of music compositions come from that. I've also been trying to fill out some gaps in his life. His most recent biographer talked about a 20-year period that was kind of empty. And I found a huge body of letters in Germany from him to various friends that exactly covered that period. That's a little more on that particular thing is a little more on the academic side. In general, I'm very interested in teaching about nature spirits and devas and how we can be living and working with them. I've done a workshop at Pumpkin Hollow on that. I did one at Ozark Camp, and I may continue to do that at various places. And the people who've taken the workshop are begging me for a book, which I hadn't thought that I would write about that subject. And I think that's probably going to be my next project. I have two essays in a book called The Cyril Scott Companion that's coming out this month in England. One of them is about his occult writings because he wrote the Initiate series, which is a fairly famous set of occult novels, and also about his chamber music. And one of the things that I was able to do, which most academics would not be able to because of their lack of theosophical training, is demonstrated how he used different musical qualities to illustrate the different levels of being. So he would use certain kinds of scales for nature spirits and a different kind for devas, a different kind for humans. And his pieces are often journeys through musical landscapes. There's a piece called Ballade for cello and piano that I wrote about that is essentially an initiation sequence, where there's like a call from the bells of a temple, sounding very mystical, and then the cello is the human voice of the person who's going through the journey, and the different musical scales that are used are the landscapes. So he ends up going through a landscape full of friendly nature spirits, and then he goes through some kind of confrontation with a dark being, and all the time the temple bells are sounding off in the distance to remind him where to go, and he keeps, as a cellist, he keeps trying to imitate them, but he doesn't quite get them right. And then finally at the very end, he's able to be completely in line with the temple bells, and at that point, the initiation sequence is complete. Cyril Scott left no writings about things like this, but once you know the key to the way that he was using the musical scales and can identify them by ear, the pieces open up in a really interesting way. I sometimes use his music in a talk that I do about nature spirits and devas, but I haven't used that piece in particular.
When we moved out here, I'm almost all retired and he's totally retired, and we started interacting with all the animals in our yard, and there's a lot of them. And I noticed they're all interconnected and intuitive. I mean, you look at them, they feel that you're looking at them. They look at me, I feel they're looking at me. And I even had I never even thought of a squirrel deva, but we were interacting so much with the squirrels because we like them and giving them peanuts. I had the voice say, "What do you want with the squirrels?" Nothing, but do you ever go over that in your course, how interconnected they all are, and
Sure,
how telepathic they really are? And I notice when other people come to our yard, they all disappear into the trees or wherever they are. They don't come out hardly. So it's
I have a story about that from when I used to live in Chicago in the early 1980s. I was walking down a sidewalk in the city, Rogers Park, and there was a squirrel. And the squirrel had just taken somebody's discarded Kleenex into its mouth. And I said to the squirrel, "You don't want to eat that." And the squirrel spit it out and then looked at me like, he just talked to me and I just heard him.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would believe him, though.
So I know what you're talking about. Okay, so what we're going to talk about and then do a practice on is something that I call aligning the elementals. So in Theosophical teaching, each one of our bodies, our physical body and our subtle bodies, astral emotional body, mental body, and actually also the causal body, I'll talk about that in a moment, has a body consciousness. And this body consciousness is called an elemental. And the elemental is not a human consciousness. So in a sense, all of us are hybrid, except that there's not a lot of blending usually between the part of us that's an elemental and the part of us that is a human soul. It's like we have this person that lives, or being that lives with us, you know, sort of like a pet, but a pet that gets us into trouble a lot. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And we have to learn how to work with this being. So each of the elementals needs to be fed in a certain way, and if it's not fed, it acts out. And most of what we see that makes us unhappy or makes us afraid in the culture around us is a result of other people's elementals acting out, which has an influence on us. And one of the things that Leadbeater especially talked about was these elementals and the way that they, mostly he talks about how they affect us after we've passed on. That's not something I'll talk about now. But he also, especially in the hidden side of things, talks about the way that elementals influence us in our interactions with other people. Because what happens is, even against our will or our better judgment or our intentions, if we're in the room with someone whose emotional or mental elementals are doing what I call spinning, they'll cause ours to spin too. And if we don't know how to damp that down, then we end up in an argument or, you know, some kind of intense acting out. So the physical elemental needs to be fed with quality sense experience. And that can be eating good food, eating healthy food, healthy exercise, being out in nature, but especially contact with the world that we live in. Visual contact by really noticing the things that surround you and the beauty of them, or anything about them, just being present with them. Noticing the sonic environment that you're in, which might be full of birds, or it might be music of some kind, or it might be, you know, you're at the gym and you're working out and they're playing God only knows what on the loudspeaker system. But anyway, being aware of the sounds that are around you. Then also touching, like we're full of, our world is full of textures of cloth, textures of trees, grass. That elemental is fed by walking around barefoot in the grass with dew on it, or walking around in the sand. Things that we do as children and then stop doing as adults. Also, quality sense experience in terms of intimacy with other people. Anything from, you know, just being touching to massage to sexuality. So when that elemental doesn't get those things, it acts out by creating addictions. We become obsessed with something. Food or sexuality, or, you know, those are two of the primary ones. Or physical excitement, such as people have when they're doing an extreme sport. Something that pushes us beyond the level of what would be considered normal and actually starts to become risky in one way or another. Addictions to drugs also, which are kind of checking out of the physical body and leaving the other bodies to drift. Alcohol, any of these things that are physical substances can be, if they're being abused, can indicate that the physical elemental is out of alignment. The origin may be in a higher body. It tends to be a sort of trickle-down thing. You know, if our mental body is really crazy and out of alignment, we may see that in the emotions and in the physical body too. So when the elementals are aligned, they're like workhorses, and they evolve by the fact that we learn how to restrain them. They also evolve by, I'll use the word channeling really strong vibrations, really strong experiences. So the spiciest food, for example, would get your mental or your physical elemental all stirred up. Whereas, in some of the meditative traditions, like Buddhism, you're not even supposed to eat onions and garlic because that will stimulate you. Personally, I feel it's the problem is not being sensitive to when it's okay and when it isn't okay with your body. Being habitually addicted to strong flavors, too much salt, that kind of thing can indicate that the physical elemental is out of alignment. But it'll be healthy, it'll have a lot of endurance, it will support you in whatever kind of work that you're doing. It'll undermine you if you're going beyond what you can actually physically do, so you can't concentrate because you've been sitting around at a desk too long. So we have to learn how to get that elemental aligned. Sweets are another thing that elemental can get addicted to. So I'm just going to go through the elementals fairly quickly, and then I'll be happy to take some questions about them. So the emotional or astral elemental has to do with our astral body. And in Theosophy, that's the body that deals with emotions and desires. And what happens when that elemental is out of alignment is, I like to call it operatic level emotional drama. It's loud, it's intense, it's big, it's designed to, really let other people know that you're there. We probably all know people who are really nice people, and we enjoy being around them, but over time we notice they start to get charged and charged and charged, and then all of a sudden there's like this electrical storm, knock down, drag out kind of experience, and then they go back to being nice, and they don't have any memory of the fact that they just had this big storm, and you're reeling from it. That's someone whose emotional elemental is out of alignment. And the good side of that elemental is that when we feed it properly with heart-to-heart experience, then our emotions are calm, and we're always on the side of the more uplifting emotions. But the ones that create problems in our own life or in other people's lives, they're big vibrations, and that emotional elemental is addicted to those. And it learns both by having access to the big vibrations, but also by being restrained. And we're better off if we learn how to restrain it, but we can only restrain it if we feed it properly. So I like to think about the elementals as being a little bit like horses. So a horse can be what's called barn sour, which means that it spends so much time being comfortable in the barn that if you try to take it out on a walk somewhere and ride it, it'll only just want to turn around and go back to the barn. So that's kind of the way we are about comfort, and our elementals like that. So horses can end up pulling us by the reins because they want to go someplace we don't want to go, and we have to learn how to restrain them. Or they can cause us to eat things that aren't good for us, or they collect experiences that aren't good for us. An example of that, I suppose, would be like a horror film. I think they serve a beneficial effect because people build up a lot of anxieties, and then here's a place you have the opportunity just to discharge all of that. But people can get addicted to that, and that's the emotional elemental that gets addicted to it. And it's not conducive to a calm, quiet, meditative state of mind. So the key is a connection to the elemental where, like with the physical elemental, I mentioned body contact. So I think of that one as being fed by body-to-body contact, quality, that kind of intimacy from friendship to partnership. And then for the emotional body, it's the heart-to-heart connection that you have with a partner when things are really good, or with a best friend, somebody that you can sit down with and talk to and pour your heart out to, and they'll do the same thing. There's a problem. I had two students who both ended their 15 or 20-year friendship with each other and talked to me about it, and each one of them said, "She never stops talking." How does that work? But I mean, that was a place where the emotional elemental was getting out of alignment, and people were, feeling like they were being deluged with stuff. So, not a good, safe heart-to-heart connection. And in our culture, how many times have you had the experience where you're out somewhere, you meet someone, you get interested, they start telling you their story. They're not interested in your story, they never ask you questions, they pour out all of the details, good and bad, and especially bad, and then it's time for them to go, they leave, you never see them again. That's another emotional elemental out of alignment. So probably the heart-to-heart connection of your listening is helpful and supportive for them. At the same time, they'll just go and do it again when they feel like, they've built up enough of a charge. It's an unconscious habit or even addiction. So the mental elemental needs quality mind-to-mind experience. And the way we get that is by being in the presence of people who think and believe similarly to the way we do, especially because we share values of various kinds. And so when you're in a group of people who share your values, like we're in now, or at some of the other kinds of meetings the Theosophical Society has, that feeds that mental elemental, and it stays quiet. But when that elemental goes out of alignment, it can go one of two ways. It either withdraws into isolation and into being fascinated by things that are interesting but not essential, and that can mean like a computer game, or trying to beat the computer game, or for me, I have to watch out for relentless research. It's like I find a Theosophical magazine from the past that's online, and I just start digging through it, and then I ask myself, well, are there more of these? And now it's 2 a.m, and I've been doing this for 4 hours, and etc. And then on the other side of that, people become really overbearing, and they're lecturers. They'll hold you hostage. They've got ideas and beliefs. They're very bigoted, and we see this, for example, at family gatherings like at Thanksgiving, where politics comes up, and suddenly everybody's just discharging on each other about, you have to believe as I do. So clearly, in our society, we have a tendency to be isolated. It's almost a part of our family and social conditioning to believe that we're only free if we're independent, and the more isolated we are, somehow the more independent we are. And then there are economic forces that do it too, because if you're feeling isolated, you'll go shopping, for whatever it is that interests you, and it'll give you a temporary feeling of satisfaction. And by being in a store with a lot of other people, you may even have a feeling of some kind of, presence with other people, but no real sense of connection. And that lack of connection is what causes the mental elemental to go out of alignment. And it creates addictive behavior, such as, let's say you enjoy photography equipment. You always have to have the best, the newest, the one that is most expensive, and you may have already bought the top of the line last year, but 6 months later another one comes up and you have to own that one too. So that's the mental elemental out of alignment. Now, the causal elemental is not talked about in any theosophical literature that I've seen. In technical terms, there is a kind of beingness called monadic essence, which is the basis of consciousness for all beings. And this monadic essence differentiates itself according to each plane and supports the beings of each plane. And it's in the process of what's called involution. It's coming down into matter stage by stage, and it goes through 3 elemental kingdoms that are called 1, 2, and 3. The 3rd kingdom supplies our astral body, and the 2nd kingdom supplies our mental body. But you'll never hear anything about what the 1st kingdom supplies. I don't really know why that is. Maybe it's because they didn't get that far, or maybe it's taught in some areas that have never been published. But that level would correspond with the causal or soul level of our being. So what I've learned in my classes is that there is also a causal elemental, a soul elemental. And when that elemental is out of alignment, what happens is a kind of depression where you can't get out of bed. And I'm not talking about like a lazy teenager not being able to get out of bed. I'm talking about you can't lift up your body. It's like you are so weighed down by the feeling, usually of uselessness, that you just can't get out of bed. I had a friend who was in that state at one time. What feeds that elemental is the knowledge that you have a reason to be here. So anything having to do with service, anything having to do with volunteer work or a life purpose of some kind, feeds that elemental and keeps it in alignment. Now, think about what I said earlier about how most of what we suffer from when we're out in the world is the result of misaligned elementals. Addiction we see in all kinds of ways all around us. All kinds of huge emotional discharges all around us. People either withdrawing into isolation and depression or becoming bigots and lecturing us. And people who are so depressed because they feel so useless that they can't do anything. Or the results of all the lower elementals going out of alignment is because there's no sense of purpose. This is talked about sometimes in theosophical literature, where the causal body or the soul loses its interest in us and goes wandering off somewhere and talks to its friends, because that's a lot more interesting than whatever it is that we're doing. And then we essentially have a soulless person, so to speak, on the physical plane, who's completely in control of that person's elementals. Now, I can use an example. Some of you who've had children or are around people who've had children will probably recognize this. So let's say you've got a child about 4 years old, and the normal bedtime for the child is, let's say, 8 o'clock. And there's a social gathering, you've brought the child to it, and it's now 10 o'clock. So what do you see? You see the child tearing around. The child's eyes are really, really wide. It's almost scary because if you look in there, it's like no one's home, or like the child is suddenly turned into their demon dark self, and you can't put them to sleep. They just have endless energy. So that's an example of the soul went to bed and the elementals are in control. So there's some disturbing stuff in early theosophical writings by Blavatsky about people without souls. And I think what she was talking about was people where the soul is not well connected and the elementals are in control. But she didn't specifically speak about the kind of elementals that I'm talking about. That was more of a Leadbeater development. So in a moment I'll ask for questions. Right now, I would like to read you a poem that I discovered in a theosophical journal called The Messenger. And this was published in the 1920s. So this was a hot topic back then, apparently, and it's called The Astral Elemental by Charles E. Luntz, otherwise completely unknown to posterity. The astral elemental's a playful little cuss. With purpose far from gentle, he makes his home with us. He teases us and nags us to do the things we shouldn't. He wearies and he fags us. We often yield. Who wouldn't? He likes us to be jealous. It gives him such a thrill. And kindly thoughts, they tell us, will make him feel quite ill. Unpleasant dispositions his breakfasts daily make. To him all bad ambitions are lemonade and cake. Oh, pray you, Do not humor this uninvited guest. Though he may be your rumor, just treat him as a pest. He bites the hand that feeds him, don't to his will be bent. Who follows him and heeds him will surely quick repent. Don't think that you must aid him to gorge his appetite, for though he's what you've made him, his notions you must fight. Oh, oust the elemental. Remember that he pays for room and board, no rental. What profit if he stays? Just think the thoughts that bore him, just feel emotions high. No need then to implore him to leave, he'll starve and die. Now, there is a little problem with that, which is you can't really kill your elementals. I mean, if you were successful in doing that, you wouldn't have one of your bodies, which probably would be a bad thing. You would, not to have an astral body means not to feel anything. So we have to learn to live with them and to work with them and to feed them properly and to support us in what we're doing. And the technique that I'll teach next is a technique of aligning the elementals using the practice that we learned this morning so that we can stabilize them, feel supported by them, and also be a beneficial influence for other people. Because most of us are constantly surrounded by people whose elementals are out of alignment, whether it's family or whether it's work or whether we're in crowds. And the problem is if they're not under our control in the way that a horse could be under our control, that big swirl of elemental stuff is going to get us spinning too. But it works the other way. If yours are under control and if you're laying out this calm vibration, then you're actually helping other people's elementals quiet down. And that, of course, creates a better, more peaceful world. And you haven't done anything to force them to do it. It's just the fact of your influence. So, any questions about the elementals?
I noticed the last few years, maybe it's always been this way, but there's been an explosion of people with food allergies, not eating gluten, all kinds of things happening. And I was wondering what part of the physical elemental, or could you comment on that and what's brought that about? Or is just bad eating, food that isn't really nutritious or food in our society?
I think all of the above, but I think, anything like that causes people to be mindful in a way they don't want to be or don't naturally want to be. And that mindfulness actually develops a quality of self-care in all areas of life. And that's a discipline, so to speak, that people aren't being taught necessarily in families anymore, at least in the sense that a lot of us aren't going to churches where we're getting some kind of ethical training, and somehow, in a lot of people's minds, ethical and religious training go together, so it's also not happening in the schools, and it's not happening in the home because the parents, have freed themselves, so to speak, from church. So this is an environment in which out of alignment elementals are really bred. And what do? They have to call attention to themselves somehow. They need proper care. So even though it seems like people are suffering with a food allergy from something that was imposed on them genetically or happened by accident, I think it could be construed as the physical elemental saying, hey, I'm here, pay attention to me, feed me. If you don't, you could die, But that's a speculation, so I won't, highlight that as an official theosophical teaching. But in other ways, given the suicide rate among young people and all the way into college, probably if the technique of learning to align your elementals were known, that wouldn't be such a problem because the soul would be there, giving you a sense of support and guidance that would allow you then to learn how to guide and support the other ones. And that's a pretty far-reaching subject. I don't want to go too much into detail about that. But I think we need to be mindful of the fact that we have elementals. People don't know what they are. We can learn to align them. Ordinarily, if you're a meditator, it happens naturally, but it might take years of watching your thoughts and emotions and separating yourself from them. And the technique that I've been teaching for elementals allows us at least to have the experience of what it's like to have them all aligned within maybe a 20-minute period. They might drift off because, we're not used to that, but you can always come back to the practice and then realign them. And it's fun in a way too that you'll understand when we actually do it, because over time we start to learn to communicate with them. And this is actually the easiest access point that we have to nature spirits and devas, is to become aware of and interact with the deva that we live with, or nature spirit that we live with, the elementals. Once that develops, it often then opens up in other areas, such as nature around us.
Can you see the elementals around people, and how do they look like if you do?
I don't actually see them, but I can tell their effects. I don't really know what they would look like. I mean, there are some passages in Leadbeater where he would say that around the slaughterhouses there are really horrible elementals that look like weird amoeba vampire things, something like that. That's a different kind of elemental than the kind that we're talking about. Elementals of the kingdom that breaks down and destroys, which is another important part of life. The elementals that we're assigned with eventually grow up into a kind of being that I call a keeper of the links. That is not something I've seen in theosophical literature, but when we're born, each of our body connections has its own guardian angel, I guess you could call, and it's the deva that takes the physical elemental and links it to the physical body, and then there's another one that links the astral body to the soul, and then I should have said soul, links the physical body to the soul. Astral body to the soul, mental body to the soul. There's a keeper of the links for all of those, and that being is with us through our whole lifetime, and is somebody that we can talk to whenever we need to know what to deal with our elementals. And sometimes they show up in the practice that I'll teach you. If it happens for anybody, I'll point it out. I can't guarantee that it will, because they show themselves when they think someone is ready. And that's not something I have any control over as a teacher. But my theory is, those, if any of you have looked into UFO abduction scenarios, read about them and so on, one typical scenario is you're taken up and away and you're operated on. And people don't understand or know what that is, but it's a fearful experience for them. Well, as I mentioned earlier, anything in the Deva evolution, which includes nature spirits, is a non-human consciousness, and therefore we'll experience it as alien to ourselves. And if our elementals or a particular one is out of alignment for a long period of time, the link between the body, consciousness, and our soul gets strained. And it can get strained in such a way that it really interferes with what's going on and starts to look like, in our relationship inside and outside, and starts to look like some form of mental illness. So then the keeper of the links will come in and do an operation of sorts to try to repair that and bring the people closer together. But again, there's nothing in our culture that supports that as a helpful thing, and all people feel and remember is the fearfulness of being around an apparently alien consciousness. So in general, I think we need to know more about the ways that we are supported by the elementals. And I've seen, when I see my own elementals, they'll show up in some ways that I'll talk about when we're doing the practice. It's probably better for a lot of this kind of spiritual development work for people to have their own internal experience of it than for someone to look at you and say, this is what I see. But it happens. Sometimes you might see something. The idea of power animals is connected to this. You might see someone's mental elemental or spiritual elemental as a power animal that protects them. I've seen things like that before. It doesn't happen all the time, but somebody came for a consultation with me one time, and the whole time she's talking to me, there's this bear standing behind her. And I mean, there are people who naturally see stuff like that, and I don't usually have that experience unless I'm really looking for it. And so finally I just said to her, do you know you have this bear standing behind you? And she got this funny look on her face and said, it's incredible you see that, because I'm always dreaming about this bear that's taking care of me. So, okay, these things happen. It was probably one of her elementals, I'm not sure which one. But that would be an example of a positive one.
I've noticed through energy healing and teaching energy healing, people can gain remarkable control or affinity with their etheric body, but I would say not necessarily their etheric elemental. Can you speak to that at all?
The problem is the word gain control of. No member of the elemental nature spirit deva kingdom likes control. They may be obedient or they may be subservient, but it's an offering as opposed to a control thing. That's why I start talking about them by saying we need to learn how to take care of them, then they work for us. But the model of magic that has been inherited and come down through centuries is that elementals, elemental beings, even angels to a degree, need to be summoned, and they need to be obedient to your will. They need to be controlled. They need to stay inside the magic circle. And I've had some astral projection type experiences where I've talked to these beings and they say, you know, if somebody would say this has got to stop, we would really appreciate it, because we pretend that we're operating under their control only to help them feel like there's a relationship. But what often happens is if it only develops their will, we break them, because otherwise they don't know the degree of our power and the fact that they can't control us. So a lot of the, stories and myths about black magicians or wizards being destroyed by the magic that they invoke, that's a story about what happens when the elementals or nature spirits or devas say, hey, we're done with pretending like we're under control. This person's dangerous and we need to put him in his place.
In my readings about psychology, addictions, something that's occurred to me is that as kind of, to me, this is evidence that there are beings that most of us don't see. When an alcoholic goes through delirium tremens, they all see the same things. They all see the same types of beings. And to me, that's some evidence that these things actually exist, because they all see the same thing. So, this isn't a question, it's just a comment, but I don't know. I really see that as, okay, clearly there's something going on here that isn't obvious to most people who are scientifically minded, but to me it seems pretty clear that there's something going on.
Yeah. And actually, to comment on that, from a couple related angles, one of them is there's a lot of interest these days among younger folks about having some kind of direct connection to the divine through DMT, which is a synthetic version of the ayahuasca psychedelic. I went to a talk about this, and apparently, something I didn't know is that the same kinds of beings constantly show up for ayahuasca or DMT people. So it's another, but they're not the same as the kinds that show up in delirium tremens. They tend to be more positive and supportive, but definitely alien. And so that's the first half of my answer. The second half is, I saw a reference when I was reading some stuff online one night to a civilization in, I believe it was Peru, and I don't remember the name of it, but it was pre-Inca, somewhere around 800 Common Era, and they were interested in using a drug called Cebil, C-E-B-I-L, which is there are beings of some kind that go through a treatment and end up being hallucinogenic, and it's something that's taken as a kind of snuff. So I was curious about this. What is this? And I looked it up, and I ended up being directed to a website where people who are exploring hallucinogenics write in great detail, but anonymously, about their experience to create a kind of knowledge base about these things. And the one that I came up with was really interesting. The person had the kind of mind that would make a wonderful clairvoyant investigator, like, you know, this is what I noticed, this is what I did, here's a record, you know, went through a lot of steps to create the stuff that he was using. And then on the other side of it, the experience that he had was going into a reality where there was a being who babysat him until he was done. Okay, now, what that tells me, A, is, you know, the people who are doing the experimentation are happening into these other realms, but they don't know what to do when they get there. And they have to be babysat so that nothing negative happens until the drug wears off. Can you imagine how many devas and teachers there might be on the other side who are just sitting there waiting for someone to wake up and say, hey, who are you? Or what do you have to teach me? Or, you know, or, hey, that's the back door. That's not the helpful or healthy door to come through. If you find another way, then I'll teach you something. So anyway, I thought since you were talking about psychology, I should bring that up too. There are lots and lots of ways to gain some kind of connection with the nature spirits and the devas, but some of them are not safe. Another one is through creative inspiration, and you have to be careful about that too, because the problem there is when you're connected with the deva, you can start to feel manic because there's this joy, and it's a cosmic joy, and it's the joy of a being who has no body and is not subject to time. And you'll see, you know, in the history of creative artists, there are all kinds of creative geniuses who forget to sleep or forget to eat during the period when they're under the influence of a deva or under an influence of some kind of creative inspiration. And I know that. I mean, I've experienced that when I've worked with it. And you have to learn how to close the door. And it's hard to do that because it's a wonderful ecstatic experience. But if you don't, the body burns out as a result. Now, we're not going to do any of those practices today. We're just going to work with the elementals. But there are many, many dimensions that this can open up to. And as I said, we can start by working with the elementals of the bodies, because they're the closest ones to us. And they also have the most investment in teaching us and our learning from them, and some kind of working relationship developing.
Maybe later you could address dream work and how elementals may be represented in one's dreams.
Okay. Actually, you may know more about that by seeing how they're represented in the practice that we're going to do. So again, in terms of a body of knowledge, everybody's going to have a different way of perceiving them, and that'll give you a wider sense of how we can experience them. So are we ready for a little practice after all of our theory? Yeah. So the basis of this practice is the landscape that we've already used. We're going to start on the witness platform. We're going to do this in 4 rounds, but I think what I'll do is we'll do 2 rounds, one for the physical elemental, one for the astral elemental, then we'll talk about it, and then we'll take a break. And then we'll do the 2 rounds, one for the mental and one for the causal elemental, and then we'll talk about that. And then we'll do a closing meditation. So in this practice, you start on your witness platform. You look off to the left to your limited self under the assumption that your elemental is out of alignment, which it may or may not be, but for most people, the first time they do this, it is. And a being of some kind or an image of some kind will show up there. And it could represent a limitation in any area of life, but it often tends to show up as a reflection of our relationship with our physical body. So, for example, if we have a fear of aging, it'll show up as a, very decrepit, falling apart kind of person. May or may not look like you, but, that's the message that you're getting. So, they can show up as energy presences. They can show up as feelings. If you don't get an image, first notice your feeling when you're looking for it in the limited self, and then say, could you show yourself to me in the form of an image? And often something will appear. But for most people, the physical elemental is the easiest one to see. And don't be surprised or shocked or shy about sharing about it if it's a mess, because most of us have challenges dealing with our body, and it's more helpful to know what the challenges are than to pretend everything is okay. And if you see something completely unexpected, that's a good sign that the image is a good representation of what you need to know. Mostly they don't appear as humans. They'll usually appear as animals or a human that's wounded or falling apart in some way. So the emotional elemental will do the same round. I'm not going to coach you about the ways that any of these can show up, but I will say that some people experience that as we go up through the bodies, each elemental is a little more subtle than the last, and sometimes, which is why I'm going to have us take a break before the mental and the causal ones. Sometimes those are more like wisps of smoke or clouds, and it can be a little challenging to perceive them. So what we do is first we see them, we get a good clear image, then we go and get near them, and we notice what we feel when we're near them. So for example, if there are things about being in a physical body, like a lot of spiritual people are uncomfortable with that, you might notice when you're near your physical elemental that discomfort is there, or you might feel a deep pity for it because it's like an animal that's in some kind of distress. And then we take the elemental with us over into the unlimited self. And what happens in that transfer is the shape of the being will change. It's usually way happier and healthier when it's in the unlimited self. And then we'll ask it what it needs from us to stay there. So it'll give us a word or an image or an activity of some kind that will help us keep it aligned. Now, the trick is some of the elementals will not move. And you might feel like you're really in trouble if it's a tree, as opposed to a being that is animate in some way. So here's where you have to be playful and creative. You could have a guide that you work with already, bring your guide. You could imagine a pair of hands coming from your higher self that can lift it up and move it over. You can make it a fun journey, like, hey, let's take a ride on a magic carpet over to the unlimited self side. You could encase the being in a crystal sphere to kind of protect it and protect yourself and move the sphere over. Sometimes they come willingly. All you have to do is just reach out your hand and walk over. Sometimes they'll put up a bit of a fight. The mental body one is often a bit of a struggle. And the idea is play and try and see what works. There's no wrong way to do it. The thing is, you really want to get it out of the limited self into the unlimited self. And it wants to go too. Although, they like their temper tantrums. And so having to give that up in order to feel bliss, well, they may not be so sure about whether that's a good thing or not. I mean, to us, you would think it would be obvious, but how many of us choose bliss over suffering, right? So, any questions about the process? We come back to the witness platform at the end of each one. We leave the elemental in the unlimited self. And by the time we've gone through all 4 cycles, all of our elementals are in the unlimited self. And it's pretty interesting to notice how it feels in the room and how it feels personally to be around people with aligned elementals, because we don't meet them in our daily lives, mostly. Okay, so once again, let's have our feet flat on the floor and no body parts crossed. And take a breath in to indicate that we're going to do a practice. Let it out when you're ready. And then do it again. Big breath in and let it out. So summon up the image of your witness platform, using the one that you developed this morning. See the witness platform as clearly as you can. See yourself on the witness platform so that you're in that landscape, connected to that emotionally neutral state of consciousness. And remember, off to the left of your witness platform is a landscape representing your limited self. Once again, just turn your attention that direction and let yourself see the image that you saw this morning for your limited self landscape. And then take a moment to turn in your inner vision toward the right so that you're looking towards the unlimited self landscape. Remind yourself what that looks like. And then bring your attention back to the witness platform. So now you're going to look out towards the left, towards your limited self, and let there be a being in your limited self landscape that represents your physical elemental. This is a being that you've had a relationship with all of your life, who's maintained the health of your body, but is also maybe misbehaved in some ways, addictions like we were talking about earlier. It may suffer to some extent from your body imagery, how you perceive yourself in the physical body. Any kind of neglect might show up there. Just look towards your physical elemental and find an image that represents it. And if you're not seeing an image, try to get a feeling and then ask it to show itself as an image. If you're casting about for an image and several different images show up, take the ugliest one. We'll just assume that that's probably the one that needs work. And once you have a good, clear image of that elemental, step off your witness platform, step into your limited self landscape, get close to that elemental, and notice how you feel when you're near it. For example, is it repulsive? Do you want to move away from it? Do you want to get closer? Is it painful to see this condition that it's in? Do you feel compassion for it? Or is there indifference? And then take a moment to summon up your strength, wisdom, ingenuity, imagination, and find a way to bring that physical elemental out of the limited self into the unlimited self landscape. And notice how it changes. It may drop the form that shows suffering and take on a much more beautiful or healthy form when it's in the unlimited self landscape. And once it it's over there, ask it a simple question. What does it need from you to stay there? You might get an image, an activity, a word, something to think about, something to do that can help your physical elemental realize its potential in this unlimited self. And then bring your focus of attention back to the witness platform. Leave this physical elemental in the unlimited self. And go ahead and take a moment and make any notes that you might want to make to remember what it is that you perceived, or to catch up if we've gone on ahead of stage. And if you're ready, turn back towards the limited self. And let's look now for another being representing your astral, emotional, elemental. The part of you that when your elemental is out of alignment acts out emotionally, with drama, emotional drama. What does that elemental look like? Notice it. And when you've got a good, clear image of it, go ahead and get close to it by stepping off the witness platform, going into the limited self landscape, getting near it, noticing how you feel, wanting to get closer, wanting to back off, remaining neutral, whatever. Then when you're ready, bring this emotional elemental with you over to the unlimited self landscape. Notice how it changes when it's in the unlimited self landscape. Ask it what it needs from you to stay there. And then when you're ready, come back to the witness platform. Leaving the emotional elemental in the unlimited self landscape. And again, if you want to make any notes, go ahead and do that. And when you feel like you're ready for us to talk a bit, open your eyes. And as we did before, if you would like to share, I may be able to offer some insights into your experience, and it also becomes a part of our knowledge base and the knowledge base of anybody who happens to be watching.
For both my physical elemental and my astral elemental, we got over to the unlimited self, but I felt like they weren't even though they complied, or even though they led me over there, or whatever the situation was, I got the felt that the situation that when I asked them what they needed, they told me, but they weren't completely satisfied yet. It was more like instructions, and then, do it in daily practice and we'll see what happens, that kind of thing. But the first one, the physical elemental, the limited self turned into a desert, whereas before it was a forest. And there was a lion that came out, but it was limping, and parts of it were like invisible, like it looked like it was like fading in and out of kind of existence. And then I tried to get it to walk across a platform which was like very like, it was either black marble or obsidian or something like that, and it wouldn't go. And then I asked what it needed, and then I grabbed onto its mane, and then it kind of pulled me along with it. And then we went to the unlimited self, and it was content in the unlimited self, and I asked what it wanted, and it basically said just to be with it, to be present with it. And then,
if I could comment on that, I
Go
think
ahead.
it would be good, because there's a lot of information there.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing that I notice is something that is important for everybody to recognize, and that is a practice like this is declaring an intention. The intention that you're declaring is to align your elementals. If for some reason your elementals don't think that you're going to do anything about it, they might let you know that it's just a temporary thing, or they'll accept it as an intention and then see if you follow through on what they tell you. And this is one of the ways that we build a reciprocal relationship with the elemental or deva, nature, spirit kingdoms. We show that we're willing to create a cooperative relationship. And the fading in and out in the limited self was probably something like sometimes you're in your body, sometimes you're not, in terms of being grounded. And that was declared as an issue that needed to be looked at. So going on?
so with the astral body, it was a forest again. It wasn't a desert, it was a forest. And I kind of reached inside that giant tree that was there before, and there was like a little green, looked kind of like some sort of monster thing, but it looked friendly at the same time, like an impish kind of thing. And like it may have been texture of like green moss or something like that. And it was very active, and it just kind of pulled me and led me towards the unlimited self. And there was like a temple in the unlimited self kind of next to the ocean side, and it established itself inside of the temple and kind of took root. And I didn't see what it would have turned into after it took root. I got the impression like it wasn't going to show me what it would turn into, but just that I should recognize somehow that it was in a temple and it took root in a temple.
Mm-hmm. I would say that you actually had a clearer perception of what an elemental looks like there, because it didn't change. The imagery that we use is always a message. So if you get a message about a wounded lion, you've got a big body and it's wounded somehow. I mean, that would be one way to look at it, powerful, like a lion. But the body consciousness doesn't actually have that form. It's taking that form to give you a message. But this little green monster being that was the same on both sides, that would be a much more reliable idea of what real contact or perceptions of a member of the Deva evolution looks like. And there could also be a message there. I mean, a monster, that really just means alien, an alien consciousness. It could mean that there's work that needs to be done there to become more familiar with that level of your being and that being who's there. But it has a lot of wisdom for you, which is why it's showing up in a temple. So it would be worth making that exploration. There are a lot of spiritual traditions that say that you should abandon the emotional self. And ignore them or transcend them and so on. But they can be powerful teachers. And you know, if you look at a painting, the thing that creates the depth are the shadows. And it's not like we have to all experience negative emotions in order to have a three-dimensional life, but our life is not fully dimensional without some kind of emotional responsiveness. And so for a being like that to show up and be an alien and also have a lot of wisdom to teach us, it's like recovering our emotional nature from those teachings that say that we shouldn't pay any attention to it. The element of desire is just another capacity of will. And I think, I mean, if I look around me, all the beautiful colors that I see are the desire of things to be seen that way, with the beauty of their colors manifesting. So there's something to explore there about the emotional reality.
I came up with the image of a soldier during wartime. So the soldier is used to discipline, obeying orders, and that's the way you treat the body. You tell it what to do, what to eat, etc., etc. But the soldier, especially during wartime, goes rogue, and the body elemental does what it wants to. When I took it over to the unlimited self, that was the Aladdin's cave with all the jewels and riches, I didn't ask him anything, but I told him, you don't have to loot. This is yours already. So that was that. And for the astral elemental, I had an image of from a Japanese folk tale. I forget the exact name, but the image was a snowfall and a stork shot through with an arrow. It's very emotional.
What did it turn out to be on the other side?
I didn't take it there.
Ah, okay.
Oh, excuse me. I was going to mention about these elementals, like I was just ambushed. Why is that? You know, that many times when you're angry, you feel yourself developing into a crescendo of an emotion. But many times I feel I'm just ambushed, like now. So why should I react to that strongly when there's no need for it, you know, on a surface
Depends on
level?
what you define as a reaction. We tend to think of tears as being a sign of someone being quote-unquote emotional, but tears have many different functions. We can laugh till we cry because we're sad, but there are also things that I call tears of truth. Those are moments when we're confronting something that deeply moves us, that is a sign on the path that we're on with the soul. And so, because your experience was very personal, I'm not going to go into a great deal of depth interpreting it, but seeing the emotional self and seeing any kind of wounding that's there that you may have stored in your limited self, because that's the nature of the limited self, and then experimenting with the idea that you don't have to put that aside, but that you can actually transform it by leading it over to the unlimited self, could be a useful exploration. And it'll be interesting to see what it shows up as.
I had a similar experience when reading Hindu devotional poetry. I'll be reading it for the aesthetic pleasure of it, and then all of a sudden a stanza will just leap out and I'll have severe weeping. So obviously there's a trigger there.
Tears of truth, that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
They should be recognized as good things. They're signs that suddenly there's a connection, a direct connection through the emotions to the soul. Okay. But our family and social conditioning doesn't say that, especially for men.
So the physical elemental showed pretty quickly. It was a big female elephant, and it was an unexpected image for me, so I think it's correct. I know it was a female because the elephant child showed for a second, and I walked closer and I saw the wrinkles and just the tiredness and almost like a feeling of unfairness, of sometimes the cruelty that the elephant goes through in this in the experience with humans. Walking the elephant to the other side was pretty easy, and it just lay down on the other side, showing the need of rest, without me even asking. The astral was more difficult because it looked like a woman, but kind of a creature-like woman. So I'm not sure about that image, but it was almost like a homeless person with some type of maybe addiction or something like that, someone like not well at all. Walking to the other side, she became a beautiful blonde woman, and the message was, what do I need? I need to meditate more.
Okay. So I'm going to ask a personal question which you can refuse to answer if you like. It's not a hugely revealing question, but I know that Latin American countries have a reputation for being very emotionally expressive. And I don't know whether you were brought up in such a culture, but you're in a North American culture where, you know, the emotional body is, or astral body is kind of ignored and shunted aside. I was struck by your imagery of a woman who was a woman, but also a little bit of a monster. And I sort of wonder whether the imagery there is feeling, you know, out of place or a little alien, because you have this naturally vibrant emotional expressiveness, and where is it around me, and where's the support for that? And, you know, what you end up with on the other side of it is radiance. Yes. You know, be yourself. So does that make any sense? That makes
perfect sense.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, if you inquire into the nature of the imagery, and especially if you see something that puzzles or confuses you or doesn't seem right, it can open up into a lesson like this.
So it was just kind of surprising, my experience. So
I like surprising ones. You know.
So I looked in my limited self, and the physical elemental showed up as a pair of legs, bare feet, bare legs, sort of like a surfer's legs, and the rest of the body was like unformed. It was like a cloud, or I couldn't see anything like that. And so when I took it to the unlimited self, it just became feet. So it was even more undefined when it went to the unlimited, a pair of feet.
So, Ed, I hope you don't mind if I tease you a little bit. It's all about defeat.
That's all. The agony of defeat.
No. So the way I would see that is you're being told to be grounded in the body and have your feet on the ground. That's the thing that you need. So when it transformed itself into the message. And possibly at a higher level, in one of the other elementals, you'll see why that's the case. But, you know, I think one of the great temptations of practices like non-dualism is the body is ignored or forgotten or somehow written out, because the experience of being in the body is automatically a non-dual experience. And so the fascination of dealing with this really intriguing idea of a higher state of consciousness needs to be counterbalanced with groundedness in the physical body. You can argue with me, you're allowed, but that's one possible way of looking at it.
Okay. I don't want to waste time arguing right now. So the emotional limited elemental was like a cloud. It was just a cloud. But when I brought it over to the unlimited self, it became a little girl with pigtails.
Mm-hmm. I think I need to refine what I was saying earlier about non-dualism, because if this idea that we have a soul that we identify ourselves with, and we also have an elemental that is the body consciousness of a body, that's a dual experience. And you can think of that as so basic and fundamental that it's hard to transcend it. And yet it really is just a model or an as-if filter way of looking at things to make adjustments in the mechanism if you want to. What I'm seeing with the formlessness in the limited self is the warning that I was talking about earlier, in the sense that you have to make the choice to do a practice like this, to accept a dualistic way of looking at things. And there's a kind of, about the astral emotional body, there's a kind of pristine innocence when it's in the unlimited self. I think that's another message about the spiritual teachings that talk to us about ignoring the emotions, and the emotions are the enemy. The enemy, if there is one, is an elemental that we're not restraining and feeding in the right way. And when we are restraining and feeding in the right way, part of the beauty and radiance and spontaneity of life is in the emotional elemental. So that's what I think you were seeing there. You may have left behind that way of thinking about the emotions a long time ago, but it can still be in the limited self, because it's just, it's a part of the past.
My physical elemental in the limited self was, I couldn't see it very clearly at first, but you know how in old Looney Tunes that when the Tasmanian devil moves, he's just a whirlwind? So that it was this black, oily creature that was spiral like that, but human shape, with four limbs and a head. Happy to come over to the unlimited self, where it transformed into a light-colored, transparent, small human form. And when I said, "What do you need from me?" This was no surprise. When I live alone and when I was working, my tendency has always been to read while I'm eating, because when I was working, I never had enough time to read all the stuff I wanted to read. And so I'm not working right now, and I've been making an effort to just when I'm eating, that's all I'm doing. And that's when I said, "What do you need from me?" The answer was to be mindful to be fully present and mindful when I'm eating. So that was no surprise. I'm going to do this again because I'm having some other physical issues that I want to ask about. But the astral one was, again, I need to do that meditation again, because it didn't have enough time to fully form. In the limited self, it was red, but I couldn't really tell what the form was. It was kind of amorphous, and the meditation moved a little faster than I would have on my own. Again, no problem bringing it over to the unlimited self. And again, it got lighter and, more transparent, but I have to do the meditation again because I don't know what it needs from me. But what I did see was quite interesting. So, thanks.
First impressions are always good, and there may or may not be more information You wouldn't know because of that feeling that I was rushing, and it's good to know that I may need to go slower for the next 2 rounds. And it's possible. I mean, you've seen, I'm sure, in Man Visible and Invisible by Leadbeater, what the aura looks like when it's full of anger. It's red, and the form, it starts to lose its form, and so on. So that's just something to keep in mind, that what you saw, a formless color, may have been what you needed to see. That may have been all there was. I'm not saying that it's anger necessarily, but that would be one possible interpretation of it. As a suggestion, maybe to do some more exploring with. But the thing is, by moving it over to the unlimited self, whatever it was, improved. And in a way, you don't need to know what any of the things that you see mean. The action of moving it from the limited to the unlimited is declaring your intention to move it towards a higher level of realization. And if it changes in a positive way, then that intention is now working for you. If you're able to get what it needs from you, then that gives you some idea of the work that you need to do. And if some part of you wants to make sure you keep doing the practice, then only getting it partially done while you're here, is a good incentive. And you declared the intention twice, so now that's in you. I mean, my experience in the classes is nothing happens without a reason. And I wouldn't be a bit surprised if anything that you do later find out about that is something you wouldn't have cared to share in a group. So you wouldn't have felt obligated to share it because it wasn't there, as opposed to wondering if you should or not. So there's wisdom behind the way these things happen, and it sometimes goes beyond what we mentally expect. And I think probably I'm sure other spiritual teachers have said this under certain circumstances, these practices are completely open-ended. The different stations and the things that you look for give you a kind of focus. There's no way to do it wrong. I mean, if you wanted to make the experiment of moving an elemental out of the unlimited self into the limited self, there's just something to learn there. Whatever shows up is valid. If nothing shows up, there isn't any work that needs to be done. If something puzzling shows up, it's there possibly because you need to explore more deeply than you're giving yourself time for. So the only thing to do wrong with the practice is not to do the practice, in a way. I mean, if your intention is to get your elementals aligned.
On the physical, limited self, I came up with, I didn't really like it images, more like the way I would be in the limited self was very picky, very impulsive, very indulgent. I had a big wake-up call this week. My neurologist called me to tell me that I have prostate cancer. So, of course, all week I was kind of thinking about that. And so that showed up in my emotional body. I'll talk about that in a minute. And so when I shifted over to the unlimited self, I became more aware of a part of me that could be very calm and more intentional with eating, much more grounded, more centered. And that's what I asked of the unlimited self, said, just be more centered in your eating, less impulsive, less indulgent, be more self-caring in ways of what's good for me, given what I know now about my physical condition. When it came to the astral, on the limited self, restless, real restless. impulsive, angry, scared. When I shift it over to the unlimited self, more mindful, more into serenity, a sense of acceptance, mindfulness, more centered. That's what it was asking me to bring that awareness to that myself. Yeah.
I don't have a comment on that because, as I said about the experience this morning, your imagery starts as energy or feelings and then comes with its own interpretations. So this is a practice where you don't need a manual to help you understand. The understanding is inside. Okay. So, and you know, elementals can go out of alignment as a result of a shock of some kind, like the news that you had. And being reminded not to live from your limited self, but be in the serenity of your unlimited self is a good message to, you know, going forward.
Do you have any ideas of any healing practices that come to mind?
I don't actually work specifically with healing things. Well, so in the book Multidimensional Human, which you've been interested in, there are exercises about activating energy hands that come from a higher level of our being, and then doing things, exploring the layers of the aura to clear stuff out and stuff in the physical body. That might be useful to explore.